Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet journey through the bustling, grimy, extraordinary world of the medieval market. As you settle in for a moment of calm and relaxation, I invite you to share in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far our community of night owls stretches across the globe. If you enjoy immersing yourself in the rich tapestry of history to unwind, consider subscribing for more soothing stories like this one. Picture, if you will, a narrow cobblestone street in a medieval town just before dawn. The air is thick with the smell of damp straw, animal dung, wood smoke, and something else underneath it all. Something harder to name. The smell of 1,000 people living in close quarters without the amenities we take entirely for granted today. Slowly, as the first gray light creeps over the rooftops, the street begins to fill. A woman arrives with a basket of eggs balanced on her head, her feet already wet from crossing the fields before sunrise. A man leads a reluctant pig on a rope. A boy carries a load of cabbages so heavy his back is bent nearly double. From every lane and alleyway, from the farms surrounding the town, from the workshops and the warehouses and the modest homes of the skilled craftsmen, they come. The market is opening. This is where we will spend our time tonight. Not in the grand halls of kings, not on the battlefield, but here, in the ordinary, extraordinary chaos of the medieval market. Because it is here, more than anywhere else, that the real texture of medieval life reveals itself. The desperation and the ingenuity, the generosity and the fraud, the brief moments of unexpected beauty in the middle of relentless hardship. Let us explore this world together, slowly and quietly, as the stalls fill and the day begins. Part 1. The Market Town. Not every medieval settlement had a market. This was not a casual thing, a simple matter of people deciding to gather and trade. A market required a royal or noble charter, an official grant of permission that came with fees and obligations and the force of law behind it. The lord who controlled a town with market rights possessed a valuable asset, because every transaction that took place in that market generated a toll, a small payment that flowed upward through the feudal hierarchy toward the hands of those who already had the most. Market towns were therefore something special in the medieval landscape. They attracted people from the surrounding countryside, drawing them in on market days like a tide, and releasing them again in the afternoon as the stalls closed and the long walk home began. For peasants who lived several miles away, a market day was an event of real significance. It required planning. It required the sacrifice of a day's agricultural labor, which was never a small thing. And it offered the rare chance to acquire things that could not be made or grown at home, and to sell the small surpluses that represented months of careful effort. Imagine a market town called Ashford, nestled in a valley between low hills somewhere in the English Midlands in the year 1280. It is a Thursday, which is market day, and the town has been stirring since well before dawn. The market square, which is large by the standards of the surrounding countryside, is dominated at one end by the parish church and at the other by the guild hall, a modest but solid timber-framed building where the town's governing council meets and where disputes about weights and measures are adjudicated. Between these two poles of spiritual and civic authority, the market sprawls. The stalls are simple structures. Most are nothing more than a board on trestles, with whatever goods the seller has brought spread out for inspection. A few of the more established traders have permanent wooden stalls with roofs of thatch or tile, small weatherproof islands of relative comfort in the general muddy chaos. But for most, the market is an outdoor affair, entirely at the mercy of the weather, and the sellers stand or sit behind their boards in whatever condition the day has dealt them. Part 2. The Sellers. Let us walk through the market and meet some of the people who fill it. Here, near the entrance to the square, is a woman named Maud. She is perhaps 50 years old, though the work of her life has made her look older. She has walked 4 miles this morning carrying 2 large baskets, one containing a dozen brown eggs wrapped carefully in straw, the other holding a small round cheese she has been aging in her cellar for 3 weeks. These represent the surplus of a month's careful management of her household's tiny farm. She will sell them if she can. Use the coins to buy a length of rough linen cloth she badly needs, and walk home with whatever is left over. Maud knows the market well. She's been coming here since she was old enough to help her own mother carry baskets. She knows which buyers will try to argue down the price, which ones will squeeze the cheese too hard and then claim it is inferior, which ones are reliable and fair. She knows the rhythms of the seasons here, knows that eggs command a better price in winter and that cheese sells fastest on cold days when people want something substantial. She sets up her small display with practiced efficiency, and then she waits. This is the other part of market day that no one quite prepares you for: the waiting. Hours of standing in whatever weather the day provides, watching people walk past, calling out occasionally when a potential customer slows down, conducting the small, intense negotiations that are the true currency of the market. A few stalls away from Maud, a young man named Thomas is selling leather goods. He is an apprentice cobbler who has been given permission by his master to sell some of the workshop's less perfect items here: the shoes with a slightly uneven sole, the belts where the stitching is not quite straight, the small pouches that are perfectly functional but not fine enough for a paying customer in the shop. These seconds find a ready market here among buyers who cannot afford the best, but still need shoes that will keep out the mud. Thomas is nervous. This is only his second time at the market alone, and he has been given a very specific set of instructions about minimum prices below which he must not go. He has also been told, in severe terms, what will happen to him if he returns with too little money. He watches the more experienced sellers around him with careful attention, trying to understand how they handle the haggling, how they know when a customer is genuinely walking away and when they are merely pretending to in order to force the price down. Part 3. The Buyers. On the buying side of the market equation, the range of people was as wide as medieval society itself, which is to say, very wide indeed. At the bottom of the scale were people like old Henry, a laborer who had worked the same lord's fields for 40 years, and who came to market with a few small coins carefully knotted in a cloth at his belt. For Henry, the market was not a place of choice and abundance. It was a place of painful calculation. Every purchase required the sacrifice of another. If he bought the rough bread he needed, there might not be enough left for the candle tallow that would allow him to work after dark in the coming winter months. If he bought the small piece of salted fish that would add some protein to his family's diet this week, the leather for repairing his boot would have to wait another month. Henry moved through the market slowly, pricing things before he committed to anything, comparing stalls, watching for the moment late in the afternoon when sellers who did not want to carry their goods home would begin to lower their prices. He was not passive in this. He was exercising a kind of expertise, a deep practical intelligence about value and timing and the psychology of commerce that he had developed over decades of necessity. It was not so different in its essentials from the expertise of a modern investor watching a market. It was simply that the stakes were more immediate and the margins were razor thin. At the other end of the scale were buyers like the steward of the local manor, a man named Ralph who came to market with a list written on a scrap of parchment and a servant to carry his purchases. Ralph was buying for a household of 30 people, and he was spending someone else's money, which gave him a confidence and a disdain that were visible in the way he moved through the stalls. He did not linger. He did not bargain extensively. He assessed the quality of goods with a practiced eye, made his decisions quickly, and moved on. The sellers straightened slightly when they saw him coming, hoping to catch his attention, knowing that a sale to the manor steward was worth 2 to an ordinary buyer. Between old Henry and Ralph, the steward lay everyone else. The skilled craftsmen with their modest but reliable incomes. The minor clergy buying on behalf of their parish. The traveling merchants sizing up local goods for potential resale in other towns. The farmers' wives with their small surpluses. The good wives of the town buying for their households. Each of them navigating the market according to their own calculations, their own needs, their own particular relationship with the coins in their purse. Part 4. Fraud and Deception. In a world where the measurement of goods was the foundation of every transaction, the temptation to cheat on measurements was constant and the practice was extremely common. Picture, if you will, a grain merchant named Walter who has set up his stall near the center of the market. Walter is not a dishonest man in the way that he thinks about himself. He attends church. He is kind to his children. He would never pick a pocket or commit a robbery. But Walter has a set of weights that have been very slightly, almost imperceptibly adjusted. The weight that is supposed to represent 1 pound actually weighs a fraction less than a pound. The difference is small enough that no buyer would ever notice by feel. But applied to every transaction in a long day of trading, that small discrepancy amounts to something real, a consistent quiet theft conducted against every person who buys from him. Walter is not alone in this. The fraudulent use of weights and measures was so widespread in medieval markets that it was simply assumed to be happening, factored into the general calculations of experienced buyers, the way we might today factor in a degree of advertising exaggeration. The authorities attempted to regulate it. Towns appointed official inspectors of weights and measures, men who were supposed to check the scales and the measuring vessels used by traders and to punish those who were found cheating. These inspectors had a difficult job. The tools of measurement in the medieval period were not precise instruments. Even an honest set of scales might be slightly off, and proving deliberate fraud rather than simple inaccuracy was not easy. The inspectors themselves were not immune to corruption. A merchant who knew his weights were wrong might find ways to ensure that the inspector's visits were never quite the surprise they were supposed to be. The punishments for those who were caught could be harsh. A baker found giving short weight might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with his deficient loaf hung around his neck. A brewer caught selling watered ale might be sentenced to drink a large quantity of their own inferior product while seated in a public place, which sounds almost comic until you consider the public humiliation involved. These spectacular punishments were partly practical, designed to deter others, and partly theatrical, a performance of justice that reassured the market-going public that someone was paying attention to the problem. Whether they actually reduced the fraud is a different question. Part 5. The Spice Sellers. Among the most fascinating figures in any medieval market were the spice sellers, and their presence tells us something important about the medieval world's relationship with distance and desire. Spices came from far away: pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands of what is now Indonesia, ginger from China and India. Saffron, the most expensive spice of all, required the hand harvesting of thousands of individual crocus flowers to produce a single ounce of the dried stigmas. The journey that brought these goods to a market stall in an English town was extraordinary, involving dozens of intermediaries, multiple sea voyages, overland routes through deserts and mountain passes, and a series of markups at each stage that ensured the final price bore almost no relationship to the original cost of production. A spice merchant named Edmund kept a stall at the Ashford market, and his position was simultaneously humble and remarkable. He was not the great merchant adventurer who had imported these goods from the Levant. He was several steps removed from that world, buying his stock from a wholesaler in the nearest large town, who had bought from a merchant in London, who had bought from a continental importer. But the goods on Edmund's stall were still objects of wonder in the market square, their colors and aromas a sharp contrast to the mud and the gray wool and the smell of animals that surrounded them. For most people in that market, the spices were things to look at rather than things to buy. A peasant family could not afford pepper. They certainly could not afford saffron. The small quantities of spice that found their way into ordinary kitchens were bought as rare treats. A pinch of something to mark a special occasion. A tiny investment in the brief pleasure of flavor. The idea of using spices as freely as the nobility did, incorporated into every sauce and every dish as a daily matter, of course, was as remote from ordinary medieval experience as a foreign country. Edmund watched the people who paused at his stall, who leaned forward to smell his wares, who asked him questions about where things came from. He had learned, over years of selling, to read quickly which of them might actually buy something. Most would not, but a few would reach into the small pouch at their belt and pull out a coin and make a purchase, and the look on their faces when he wrapped the tiny quantity of spice in a scrap of linen and handed it over was something he never quite got tired of seeing. Part 6. The Animals. No medieval market was complete without animals, and no aspect of the medieval market was more chaotic, more noisy, or more aromatic. Livestock markets were fundamental to the medieval economy. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, chickens, geese, and ducks all changed hands in the market square, and they did so loudly. The bellowing of cattle, the panicked squealing of pigs, the indignant honking of geese, the constant anxious bleating of sheep, all combined into a wall of sound that made normal conversation nearly impossible in the animal section of the market. A farmer named William had driven 3 young pigs to market this Thursday, a journey of 6 miles that had taken most of the morning and tested his patience to its limits. Pigs, as anyone who has ever tried to move them will attest, are not natural followers. They have their own opinions about direction and speed, and they express those opinions with considerable force. William had lost one pig entirely in a ditch about 2 miles from home, had spent 20 minutes retrieving it, and had arrived at the market later than he had intended, sweating and covered in mud, to find that the best positions near the main entrance were already taken. He was nevertheless hopeful. He needed the money from these pigs to pay a rent that was coming due, and the animals were healthy and well grown, which gave him a reasonable basis for confidence. He positioned himself where he could catch the eye of likely buyers, held the pigs as still as they were willing to be held, and began the complex social dance of negotiation that was the heart of the livestock market. The buyer who finally stopped and showed serious interest was a butcher from the town, a man whose round red face and blood-stained apron announced his trade before he opened his mouth. He looked at the pigs with a professional eye, commenting on their faults, which were apparently numerous, in a tone of mournful dissatisfaction that William recognized as the standard opening gambit of every buyer in the market. He had expected this. He had set his price accordingly, starting high enough to leave room for the inevitable argument. The negotiation that followed lasted 20 minutes and involved both men at various points declaring themselves insulted, turning away as if to leave, and then returning. It was performance as much as commerce, both parties understanding the rules and playing by them with a kind of grim enjoyment. William finally sold his pigs for slightly less than he had hoped and slightly more than he had feared, which is to say that the transaction was a success. Part 7. The Dangers of the Market. The medieval market was not simply a place of commerce. It was also a place of danger, in ways both obvious and subtle. Pickpockets operated in markets with the confidence that comes from a target-rich environment. A crowd of people, many of whom were carrying more money than they normally possessed, all distracted by the business of buying and selling, was an ideal working environment for a skilled thief. The crime was common enough that experienced market-goers had developed a set of habitual precautions, keeping their money pouch against their skin rather than on their belt, never displaying more coin than necessary, keeping a hand on their goods at all times. There were other dangers, too. In a world without food safety regulations or the scientific understanding of contamination, the meat and fish sold in the market were not always what they appeared to be. Butchers who were less than scrupulous might pass off spoiled meat as fresh, disguising the smell with spices, or selling it late in the day when the light was poor and the buyers were tired and less careful. Fish that had been fresh 2 days ago might still be on sale today, its deterioration masked by a thorough washing and a hopeful expression on the seller's face. A woman named Alice had bought a piece of salted fish at the market one autumn afternoon, paying more than she could easily afford for what had appeared to be a good quality piece of cod. She had carried it home carefully and cooked it for her family that evening. By morning, her husband and two of her children were seriously ill. The illness passed, as it usually did in the young, but her husband was confined to bed for 3 days, which meant 3 days of work lost, which meant a small but real disaster for a family whose margins were already thin. Alice knew who had sold her the fish. She had gone back to the market the following week and said exactly what she thought about him in the loudest voice she possessed, which had the effect of driving away several of his customers and earning her a stream of furious abuse in return. Whether anyone in authority ever did anything about it is another matter. Market regulation was imperfect, enforcement was inconsistent, and the seller in question was still there the following month, looking as cheerful as ever. Part 8. The guilds behind the surface chaos of the medieval market lay a web of organization more complex than it might appear, and much of that organization was provided by the guilds. The guilds were associations of tradespeople and craftsmen, organized by trade, that controlled who could practice a given craft within a town, set standards for the quality of work, regulated prices and wages, and looked after their members in times of hardship. They were, in a sense, a combination of trade union, professional association, licensing authority, and welfare organization, all rolled into one institution that was also deeply connected to the religious life of the community. Every guild had its patron saint and its chapel, and the religious and the commercial were thoroughly intertwined in the way medieval people understood their working lives. Being a member of the guild was not just a professional credential. It was a statement about one's place in the community, in the cosmic order, in the network of obligation and mutual support that held the social fabric together. To become a member of a guild, a young person typically entered as an apprentice, usually in their early teens, bound by contract to a master craftsman who would teach them the trade over a period of years. The conditions of this apprenticeship varied enormously. Some masters were fair and patient teachers who fed their apprentices adequately and treated them with reasonable kindness. Others were harsh, demanding, and exploitative, extracting the maximum amount of labor from their apprentices while providing the minimum in return. A young woman named Joan had been apprenticed to a weaver at the age of 13. The weaving guild in her town admitted women, which was not true of all guilds, and Joan had shown an aptitude for the work from her first weeks in the workshop. She learned quickly, her fingers finding the rhythm of the loom with a naturalness that made her master nod approvingly, though he would never have said so out loud, approval not being something he distributed carelessly. After 7 years, she would be a journeywoman, qualified to work for wages in any weaver's shop. After more years and the completion of a masterwork, a piece of weaving so fine it would demonstrate her skills beyond question, she might become a master herself, with her own workshop and her own apprentices. It was a long road, but it was a road with a destination, which was more than most people of her background could say. Part 9. The End of the Market Day. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to change, the market transformed. The buyers who had money to spend had mostly spent it by early afternoon. What remained in the hours before the close of trading was a different kind of commerce, more desperate on both sides. Sellers who had not sold as much as they needed to sell began to lower their prices, making calculations about what was worth carrying home and what was worth letting go cheaply rather than lugging back along the road. Buyers who had been waiting precisely for this moment began to move through the stalls with renewed attention, looking for the opportunities that the end of the day always produced. Old Henry, the laborer we met earlier, came into his own in these final hours. He had spent the morning and early afternoon watching and waiting, his few coins still knotted in the cloth at his belt. Now, as the sellers grew anxious and the prices dropped, he moved. He bought a quantity of barley from a farmer who had too much left over and was facing a long walk home. He bought a piece of wool cloth from a weaver who had cut it wrong and could not sell it at full price. He bought, at the very end, a small piece of dried fish from a seller whose expression of relief at making even this modest sale was clearly genuine. He walked home in the fading light, his basket heavier than it had been in the morning, his few coins mostly gone but converted into things that would feed and clothe his family through another stretch of the difficult weeks ahead. It was not triumph exactly, but it was something. It was the result of a long day of careful, attentive effort, and old Henry allowed himself, somewhere in the middle of the muddy road, a moment of quiet satisfaction. Part 10. What the Market Meant. As we have walked through this medieval market together, a picture has emerged that is more complex than the simple image of a quaint historical scene. The medieval market was a place of genuine human drama, played out against a backdrop of hardship and ingenuity and occasional dishonesty that feels, across the centuries, surprisingly familiar. The gap between Maud with her eggs and the manor steward with his list was not merely a gap in wealth. It was a gap in possibility, in the degree to which the market was a place of choice rather than necessity. For the wealthy, the market was a convenience, a place to acquire things they wanted. For the poor, it was a lifeline, a place where small surpluses were converted into small necessities, where margins that left no room for error were navigated with care and skill. And yet, in the market square, something happened that happened in few other places in medieval society. Different classes of people stood within feet of one another, conducted transactions with one another, argued with one another. The market was not an equal space, not by any means. But it was a space where the rigid hierarchies of medieval life were, for a few hours a week, somewhat scrambled. Old Henry and the manor steward might find themselves standing at the same stall, making the same calculation about the same piece of cloth, and in that moment, the difference between them was only in the number of coins available to act on the calculation. In our modern world of supermarkets and online shopping, of food delivered to our doors and goods sourced from across the globe, it is easy to forget that commerce was once this immediate, this physical, this human, that every exchange involved looking someone in the eye and reaching some kind of agreement, that the quality of everything you ate and wore and used depended on your ability to judge, to negotiate, to build relationships of trust with the people who supplied your needs. There is something in this that we have gained enormously from losing, and perhaps something we have lost by losing it. The medieval market was exhausting and muddy and frequently fraudulent, but it was also alive in a way that our modern systems of distribution, for all their efficiency, cannot quite replicate. So the next time you find yourself in a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, or browsing a street market in a foreign city, or simply standing in a queue at your local shop, Take a moment to think about Maud and her eggs, about Thomas and his leather goods, about old Henry and his careful coins. They were doing something very similar to what you are doing, shaped by the same basic human needs and the same basic human impulses, in a world that was harder but perhaps in its way, no less rich. And with that, dear listener, I bid you good night. I hope this quiet walk through the medieval market has given you something pleasant to carry with you into sleep. The stalls are closing now, the sellers packing away their goods, the buyers heading home along the muddy lanes. The market square is emptying, and the town is settling into the particular quiet of a market day evening, the kind of quiet that comes after a great deal of noise. Let that quiet settle over you too, and carry you gently into the dark. If you have enjoyed this journey, I would love it if you would subscribe and share these stories with someone else who might find comfort in them. There are always more quiet corners of history to explore together. Good night. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.